be done with the recap. So hello everyone. It's great to see you guys again. Ranjini will lead today's session, but I'll quickly recap our discussion from last time, probably just a couple of minutes. So I hope you remember we started with a quick round of introductions, and then we did a poll to understand how we feel about social research, what kind of experiences we have, etc. And then we moved on to talking about what is social research, defining it, why it is important, etc. A lot of you shared field experiences as well. And then we did a breakout session where we discussed The Last Shepherdess, a film by Tenzin Dorje, which talks about his sister's journey as a herder in Ladakh. Very cool, interesting observations by all of you and a great discussion as well. And then we did a wrap up and sort of talked about what we are going to do in the following session. So if there are any quick comments or questions about the previous session, we can take them now. If not, then I guess Ranjini can start with this session.
Thanks, Saloni. I hope my internet stays okay because okay, so I'm going to share my screen. So what we're going to be looking at today is looking at research questions and study design. And it's not actually that different from qualitative, I don't want to say qualitative, but the ecological research that all of you have probably been exposed to in the previous sessions. It's not, so looking at the research questions and study design is not that different from what you might have been exposed to, but within the context of the social sciences, we look at like what are the main differences also that can emerge in this. So for example, qualitative research, like qualitative data collection, is almost exclusively part of the social sciences. It's unlikely to be found in ecology, right? The second thing which I think is interesting is that, so in ecology, you can go out there, there's something that's fixed, you measure it, it's done, and that's done. But when it comes to the social sciences, people respond to us. So us as interviewers going into a space, they're going to be responding to how we are. That's going to impact our data collection. That's going to impact our results. That's going to have a huge implication on that. So that we're not going to cover so much, like, the impact of the researcher in this study, but in the next few sessions, we'll be looking into that as well. And of course, there's also ethical considerations when it comes to human dimensions of conservation, right? So ecological as well, there's a lot of ethical dimensions, but it varies in the aspects we're looking at. And ethics we'll also be covering in the next session. So I'm just going to start my Raki, can you actually not Raki, Sal, can you run the first poll?
Yes. Oh, sorry, let me relaunch.
Should I stop sharing before?
Yeah, just a sec.
Okay.
Just a second. Can you guys see it?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So so almost everyone has said all of the above. We can end the poll. My cursor is missing. Yeah. So almost everyone has said all of the above. And the research question, 23%, data collection about 15%. So a lot of people say the most important part of research is the research question, because everything else falls into as good. I mean, your research is as good as the question that you ask. So asking this question is like super important, right? So, and in this session, we're going to be looking at, what makes a good research question? What are the kinds of research questions we can ask in the social sciences? And during the breakout sessions, we'll be using the trophy hunting case studies that were lent to kind of formulate our research questions. Now, if you haven't had time to read it, it's okay, because people have opinions about trophy hunting and all of that, so you can still ask the questions, but the reading material will help you formulate these questions better. Right? So what is the research question? That is the crux of research in some sense, because that's what we're going to be finding out. That's what we're going to be answering. That's what our study design is going to be about. So I'm going to ask this question. This seems really obvious. Wait, why is this not? Sorry. Oh, damn. Yeah. So who chooses the research question? You can... I'm sorry, I'm just trying to figure out my screen because I can't see the chat. But, okay, Sal, will you read out the stuff from the chat if people put it in?
Yes.
Okay, great. So you guys can either unmute and answer, or you can put it in the chat. So who do you think chooses the research question?
So before that, Daniel says, I would say that when you don't have a good question to answer, it doesn't matter how you do the other parts.
Yeah.
And Aliana agrees.
Yeah, that's true. Because if you have a question that's not going to be answered or can't be answered, then it's difficult. Or even something that's like uninteresting. Do we have any responses on who chooses the research question?
Not yet. I think people might be typing.
Okay. Who do you think, Saloni, chooses the research question?
Iftikhar says the researcher.
Okay.
Researcher. Letro
Yeah.
and Daniel also say the same.
Yeah, cool.
Arina says the ones funded.
Yeah, the ones who are, our funders. Also, that's true. So,
Yeah.
okay, so there's actually
Shobhit says
dimensions
researcher.
to who can choose the research question. So one is, of course, the researcher, that's us. We can ask, okay, based on our interest, based on the kind of, our literature, but primarily driven by our motivations and our values, we can ask the research question. And like a lot of people are saying, the funders can drive what you're interested in because that's where the money is. But at the end of the day, it's still you asking those questions. So you might be like, okay, where's the money? What kind of questions can I ask that will give me funding? Now, there's another way of also asking a question, which is particularly relevant for the social sciences. And this is when it's called participatory action research and also transdisciplinary research, transdisciplinary research borrows from participatory action research. So what happens in these cases is that the research questions are driven by the local community. Right, so in participatory action research, which is PAR for short, and it was actually developed a lot in South America, where where the local communities ask, so you go meet the local community, and the questions come from them. Right, so there's a whole method of doing this. So you go into the community, you sit with them, you listen. There's a lot of active listening that happens, and listen to what their issues are, kind of understand what are the questions that they find interesting and they want to ask, and those are the questions that researchers end up asking. So the questions are driven by the local community. So transdisciplinary research borrows from participatory action research, but it's also wider. So in these cases, it's like society in general, as broad as it can be. So it's also policymakers. So an example of transdisciplinary research is, the IPBES, Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Ecosystem Services and Biodiversity. That's a huge handful. So how they get their questions is that the policymakers and the governments give them questions that they then find researchers to answer. It's the same as with the IPCC. So in these senses, sometimes the policymakers are driving questions. Sometimes it's also like society at large. So the questions can come from different perspectives, from the researcher or from the local community or from society at large. And I just want to ask, what do you think are the advantages and disadvantages? Let's say when a researcher is asking the question, what do you think are the advantages and some of the disadvantages, or let's say biases perhaps, when the researcher is asking the questions?
Danielle says, what is ADV? I'm not sure. Science oriented.
Advantages. Advantages.
Advantage. Okay.
Okay, so when a researcher is asking, it can be science oriented. So it's based on theory, it's based on literature, it's based on our scientific background in some senses.
Disadvantage, Emmanuel says, there can be individual bias.
Yes. Yeah. So it can be driven by our own values, our own interests.
Aliana says, you are asking something you are interested in and have experience in,
Hmm.
so you are equipped to do it, but could be very biased and possibly miss an important view or
Yeah.
component.
Yeah. Exactly. So yeah, so those are some of the advantages and disadvantages. What about when it's with local community, when it's driven by outside sources in some senses? What do you think could be the advantages and the disadvantages?
Advantage, Daniel says that it is based on real world problems and
Yeah,
challenges, so high priorities. Hoop
yeah.
Dorji says the problem can be real based on the field reality.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So it can be very often, sometimes we ask research questions that are not applicable. It's of interest to the academic committee, but it's not the community, not committee, the academic community. But when it comes to real world application, it has very little applicability and it might not translate. But then if questions come from the community, it comes from society, it's questions that are applicable to real world problems, and it's set out to solve a particular problem, right? So those could be certain advantages. But what are the disadvantages when it's driven by local community, when it's driven by outside interests?
It may be skewed to drive an agenda, Emmanuel says.
Yeah, exactly. So that is actually one of the biggest disadvantages. And it can also be, so the skewed agenda driven can also come from us because we might also have a particular point which we want to do. But even with the local community, that can be there, but there can also be influence. Like they can influence, so like because they wanted to say something, they can influence your results, they can influence your analysis, so they can exert a lot of external influence on you as well. So sometimes you're not completely independent, and having to navigate that can be an issue. So yeah, so these are, two ways in which one can develop research questions and where places it can come from. And right now, like we had mentioned, I think probably research driven by researchers, questions driven by researchers was one of the main ways of doing research for a very long time, until like participatory action research that started developing in South America, and now it's gotten a lot of traction. And transdisciplinary research, which is newer, but again it's getting a lot of traction because they're looking at solving, like all of you had, some of you have mentioned, solving real world problems where research is actually action oriented, right? So Sorry, I'm trying to, okay, just give me a second. Okay, okay. So, I so these are two quotes that I like, which for me were really important because when I first started out, like everyone tells you that science is objective, it's based in the truth, and it's completely established, all of that. But actually, science is driven by, it's not free of values, it's not free of judgments, and it's within a worldview that each of us come from, or there are institutional agendas, all of that. So I think it's important that when we ask these questions, we remember that most of these we can try to be as objective as possible, but very often our own values and our own personal judgments and institutional agendas influence the questions that we ask, and also can influence our outcomes as well. So that is one quote that I kind of like. If you disagree with this, please feel free to type it in or even unmute yourself and disagree. But yeah, so that's one. The other thing that I like, this is from Twitter, Daniel Gonzalez, a person on Twitter, and he says science is driven by people and people are messy. And I find this also really resonated with me. But yeah, I'm open to, if there are people who disagree with this and think, that yes, actually science is completely objective, I'm open to hearing your perspectives as well. So you can either type it in or, jump in. Yeah. So, okay. So when we're looking at social sciences, what are the kinds of research questions we can ask in the social sciences? So this is in some senses, the dimensions of conservation that social sciences covers, right? So on one perspective, so you have people and you have conservation, nature, community, So initially when it's first started
Sorry
out.
to interrupt, Ranjani.
Yeah.
Helena has left a comment for your
Yeah.
previous question. So the
Yeah.
whole topic is such a complex problem with so many cross-cutting concerns. Personal belief agenda has no place in investigation and implementation and can't factor in.
Okay. Cool. Helena, would you like to say more about that?
So one of the things that I study is complex adaptive systems, and we approach problems like this with, they're particularly always going to have so many different aspects. And everything that I look at for the type of things that you're covering with social sciences applied, in the context of these issues, it's so complicated. It seems so much more difficult than simply doing population assessments and how are you designing your surveys and things like that. It's really, really difficult. And you really can't, I know people say it's hard, but you can't put your own personal awareness, etc., into these.
Yeah, I agree with you, Helena, and I think that's why the methodology attempts to be free of that. But in my opinion, like I had said before, I think worldviews and the views we come from, we're limited by that. It's the way we see the world, and maybe we'll go into a little bit that, but this is open for conversation, and there's different paths as well as we look at it. So thanks for sharing, Helena. If other people also want to chime in, and it can be quite a long discussion, also please feel free to type in. Thanks for sharing, Helena. Okay, so then, so what are the kind of research questions we can ask in the social sciences? So when it first started out, there was community and there was nature conservation. And then, they were okay, people are driving a lot of these issues. So we need to understand human behavior, right? So we need to understand what are the values, what are the motivations, what are perceptions that can drive human behavior to have certain impacts on nature. So a lot of that started with understanding of human behavior, understanding values, and this literature and the theory for that, a lot of it came from economics, it came from psychology, and it came from sometimes philosophy also, what are values, describing values, things like that. And we're happy to share some of this literature later, like, as additional reading if people are more interested in the theories behind it. Then, of course, there's also like governance and management of resources. So based on how, human behavior, how people value things, people also govern natural resources. So they were like, much of this was driven by Eleanor Ostrom and, the research in the commons, where initially people were like, initially there was a hypothesis which has been disproven quite a lot, where they said, where Halden said that, if people can't manage resources because the commons, and, it will eventually become overused and overexploited. But what Ostrom showed was that if you have communities that can manage their resources, it doesn't go, it's not going to be overused, right? So it's not that it's more about the management regimes that determine whether things are going to go extinct or not. So there's been a whole literature, there's been a body of literature looking at what is good management of resources, under what conditions do communities and people manage their resources well. So with the previous thing where they were saying that you can't really manage resources, a lot of it was, for national parks, for, making these national parks so that they can protect diversity. But with the understanding that people actually can manage their resources, that started shifting towards, more community-based models of governance as well. So far we're looking at a one-directional impact, right? Like, how are people going to be impacting biodiversity? How are people going to be impacting conservation, nature, all of that? Then there's another, then people realize, wait, actually, there's also the feedback loop where, okay, the most obvious one would be what are the conservation effectiveness of our program? So if human behavior impacts this, if we have conservation interventions, does that impact human behavior, and does that change towards a more positive way, right? So there were studies on that, which again, there's a lot of literature from economics and psychology that look at, like wording, something, and sometimes it's simple things like wording, how can that impact behavior, but also more things as like, values. How does conservation interventions change values? Like, for example, payments for ecosystem services, when there's a money component that comes in, how does that impact values? Then there's also the social justice realm of it, because they're saying that conservation interventions don't always impact everyone in society the same way. Right? So some people might be more impacted by it, some people might be less impacted by it. Sometimes women bear a lot of the brunt of these interventions. Sometimes whole communities, like local communities, when they're ejected from national parks, there's been a whole conversation around that as well. So the social justice realm looks at what are the kind of impacts that conservation itself can have on people, and moving towards more just and equitable modes of conservation. So again, literature from this is informed by, a lot of the social justice literature. It comes from economics, it comes from philosophy, psychology. So it's a whole bunch of interdisciplinary fields there. And then, of course, they started questioning this divide between nature and people. Right? So we're just like, okay, people and nature are quite different. But then the idea of nature itself is, it comes from somewhere, right? Which follows the idea of the wilderness, which follows the idea of something that is far away, that is remote, that is untouched by people, which in itself is an idea, right? Where protected, which people say develop with a lot of like, especially when the British came to America and started seeing like these untouched wilderness areas. So these ideas of nature started developing there. But increasingly, there's been a huge recognition that what we call nature is actually an idea, it's a construct. And not everybody across the world sees it the same way. Very often, even the term nature itself doesn't exist in many local communities or indigenous communities, because they see themselves as a part of nature. They are nature. So then to have like, a different, because if you have the term nature itself, it means that it's something that's outside of you, that is separate. But sometimes you don't have the term. You have like, okay, this is water, this is land, this is, you have different terms like that. So that's been an interesting discourse that's been happening, like recognizing that people and nature are not actually separate. And even the recognition that people and nature are separate stems from a particular worldview, which for a very long time was what drove science, our Western science. And recognizing that people are like taking a step back and trying to incorporate different worldviews into science so that these are also incorporated, right? So there's like indigenous, so that's what indigenous local knowledge traditions, biocultural diversity. So a lot of those ideas have started coming in. And then of course, finally you have like reflections within conservation itself. So even within the conservationists, and how do people being in the landscape, these ideas of how do people's worldviews influence the questions they're asking. How does composition, like for example, men predominantly are in the science field, so how does that influence the questions that we're asking? How does that influence the interventions that we propose? So there's a lot of reflections within that itself. So in some senses, this is a very broad view of the different kinds of evolution that's happened between conservation and the social sciences, and where theory can come in, right? So this is what we thought we'd share a little bit of later for additional reading, like theories on which some of these ideas are built, and how this has moved the conservation, how social sciences in these different aspects has moved ideas of conservation forward, and how it's changed the ideas of conservation with time. So yeah, so if we want to ask research questions in social sciences, these are some of the dimensions within which you can potentially ask, like how people influence nature conservation, the other way, reflections within it. So yeah, that's any questions, please feel free to type or, just interrupt. Yeah, so framing a research question. So coming to that, so this, to prove that trophy hunting increases local community income. So that's a question. I want to know, do you think that question is okay? Do you think there's a problem with that question? And if you can tell me why you think, what is problematic of this question? So actually all of them are a little bit, do you think they're okay, or do you think these questions are problematic? So the first one is to prove that trophy hunting increases local community income. The second one, to study the impact of trophy hunting on local community attitudes across the snow leopard range, to understand if trophy hunting is good for the local community, to understand the feasibility of initiating a trophy hunting project in Spiti Valley in India. So if you feel any of these questions are problematic, can you perhaps type or even unmute yourself and say why you think this is problematic? Which ones firstly are problematic, and why do you think it's problematic?
If I could say one thing about that.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I'm not. Yeah.
So in the Rhino podcast,
Yeah.
it brought up, a really interesting thing about, I'm not really sure exactly what bullet point I would attach it to, but how their argument is basically that, they're saying that, for example, in this case, the Namibian government is making decisions and making available what they're deeming a, quote, resource, the wildlife. They're not, in that case, free-ranging wildlife, but they're basically making that economic argument that it's an income that goes back to support conservation of endangered species. And I question whether, I don't really know if they got around to fully addressing whether that killing of them, the trophy hunting, is really needed, if it's just a matter of the money that's needed.
Yeah, no, that's a valid point, and that's also a question one can ask. Is trophy hunting the only way that this is? I agree with you on that as well. Like, they have an economic argument for it, and is that only way that also remains. And some people say yes in some of the literature, and a lot of other people say no. And but it's also, I think, I don't know, this is just my opinion, I also think it's based on the history of a space, right? Because one of the reasons they say that trophy hunting brings in so much money in Africa at least, that apparently no other model is going to be able to replace that model of conservation, which is, because it brings in so much money, and tourism apparently doesn't replace that by itself. But I mean, I don't know. I think that history of conservation in a place also matters, because there's a lot of one of the pieces that we had also shared looked at Black people, African perspectives on trophy hunting, where they thought it was a very colonial form of conservation as well. And if that has been the strongest source of income for a really long time, and for the history in that space is dependent on that, then maybe removing it might be very difficult. But perhaps other methods can be looked at. I don't know. It's a very debated topic, which is why we sent it out, because we thought that people can debate. So yeah, so any things on this, like looking at these as research questions, do you think any of these are problematic? Oops. Ah, sorry.
Can I chime in?
Yes.
Okay. So, from the 4 questions that have been given, my guess is that the first one might be problematic. Sandesh also says the same. Number 1 point doesn't seem appropriate to me. To prove, question mark.
Yeah.
Emmanuel also says, first one sounds more like an agenda rather than a question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Aliana also agrees.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's right, actually. So kind of all of them are problematic in some senses. So the first one, to prove that trophy hunting increases local community, I think there's a very strong bias. And like everyone's saying, it's agenda driven, right? Like to prove means you've already decided that trophy hunting is going to increase local community income. How are we going to show that this is true? So that is agenda driven, it's biased, it's, that's problematic. The second one, to study the impact of trophy hunting on local community attitudes across the snow leopard range, can also be problematic, because it's not defined very clearly. It's so broad. Is it answerable? Is it across? And to study the impact. So it's, maybe you can do it through literature review, maybe you can do it through literature study, but if you want to do it through data collection, maybe that's not very practical, because it's across the snow leopard range, it's not focused. It's, which countries do you want to look at? What kind of trophy hunting do you want to look at? There's a lot of different dimensions that might not make this very answerable, right? So the third one, again, to understand if trophy hunting is good for the local community, it's the same issue with prove, right? Because good is also, okay, firstly, what do you mean by good? There's so many dimensions to good, it's not clearly defined. And the second thing, again, good has value connotations to it. So that's also biased in that sense. And the last one, actually, it's a bit too specific, to be honest, but to understand the feasibility of initiating trophy hunting project in Spiti Valley in India, that is probably not a very relevant question, because in India, you can't, there's laws against trophy hunting. So it's not a relevant question to ask in this landscape. And if some of you have attended the community conservation module, like the one that happened before, and I know a lot of you did, if you remember, Charu had said something about aptness, no? About how, like, even with, because a lot of them are Buddhist, their sentiments might not align with trophy hunting in that landscape. So that's probably not a very relevant question to ask in the context of that landscape. So coming back to this, so what makes a good research question? So one, of course, it has to be non-biased, like all of you were pointing out. So the second, it has to be focused, so that it defines your question. It defines the parameters within which you're asking this question. And the focus can come from either defining what you mean by the words, like trophy hunting of, say, argali, or trophy hunting of ibex, in in Kyrgyzstan, and if it's answerable, if there are 4 areas, you can look at 4 different areas, or maybe a particular area, which is say Alatu. Trophy hunting of Argali in Alatu is a very specific, answerable, focused question. And of course, that comes back to answerable. Do you have the resources? Do you have the manpower? Do you have what it needs to answer these questions? And finally, it should be relevant, right? So it needs to be relevant to the landscape. It needs to be relevant to research by identifying the gaps. So these are some elements of a good research question. So if we go back, if we go back and we were to say, to prove, like if we were to reframe this into something that's answerable and something that's focused, if we want to say to study the impact of trophy hunting, of say just trophy hunting, because maybe there's only Argali in Alatu, on local community income in the Alatu range. So that would be focused, answerable, and relevant, because trophy hunting happens in that landscape already. So that's just one example of the different elements of a good research question. Now, coming back to this, which is induction, deduction and induction, which Saloni covered in the last class. What are the different kinds of methodology? So you have deduction, where you have like a theory. You start with a theory, you start with a hypothesis, you go to observation, and then you go into confirmation, right? So you start with a theory and then you go out there and confirm it. And then you have induction, which starts with, you go, you observe, and then you work yourself up. You observe, then you look at the patterns that are there, you get a hypothesis, and you get a theory. So this is more along Sherlock Holmes and what he did, and the other method is Aristotle's method. And the reason we bring this up is because the research questions and induction and deduction is a way of doing science, and there's different conversations around it. Some people say one is better, some people say the other is better, but actually it just gives you different kinds of information. And different kinds of questions are either induction or deduction, and it determines the kind of study design you have, the study methods you use, and how you're going to go about it. So for deduction, for example, where you start with a theory, hypothesis, observation, and then confirmation, it's very often quantitative, right? You have like prefix parameters, and you go out there. So for example, if you're just looking at the impact of and it's hypothesis driven. So like if they're coming back to the local community income, your hypothesis might be that local community income increases with trophy hunting, and the question might be to study the impact of local community of trophy hunting on local community income. So this is a deduction process. But for an induction process, you might look at what are the factors that can increase local community income. What are the factors related to conservation that can increase local community income? So in that senses, you are, it's broader, and you're actually going out there, you're observing, you're looking at patterns, and then working your way up. So in the previous method, which is the deduction method, most of it is often very quantitative. You have like fixed questionnaires, you have fixed surveys, you have like, statistical analysis that can help you answer that. But in induction, you can use quantitative, but very often you can use qualitative, right? So you have like focus group discussions, you have open-ended questionnaires, you have like, it's not questionnaires are closed, but you have like unstructured interviews, and then you can really go wide and look at the different kinds of factors and analyze it like that. Does anyone have anything to add? Any questions, anything? I'll just break for a minute.
There is an interesting discussion around trophy hunting that's in the chat. So
Okay.
I hope all of you are monitoring the chat as well.
Okay.
So, for example, Helena says, while the funds to support locals, trackers, conservation protection with rangers, etc. is a good question, can funds be made available without trophy hunting?
Mm-hmm. Great.
Then she continues by saying trophy hunting being deemed beneficial for local communities really also depends on the trickle down from the income going in part to local trackers/rangers, etc. But how much really just stays with the government? Then Iftikhar responds, how to tackle trophy hunting if it is of cultural and regional importance, not economically driven. And Ghulam also made some interesting observations. So sometimes communities think that they get income from the ibex, but not snow leopard. And then they question when the snow leopard kills the ibex. Um, Communities, in fact, asked for ensuring markhor because they are high value, economic value. And overall, he thinks trophy hunting is good for conservation. In Pakistan, the result of, Mohammed says, in Pakistan, the result of trophy hunting is good. When local communities get their share, they work more effectively for conservation.
Yeah, fantastic. That's a really interesting discussion. And I think all of you should keep that in mind when we go to our breakout groups. And for now, maybe we can pick out any one of those questions to illustrate this point. So I think the last one was someone saying that they think it is good for conservation. In Mohammed, I think, said it's good for conservation in Pakistan. Right, Sal?
Yes, and Ghulam.
And Ghulam. Okay. So let's take that. Okay. And let's look at that as a question. And so let's rephrase it as a question that we want to answer. Okay. So say, and trophy hunting of what happens there, Ghulam? Help me. I think it's Argali, right? Or Markhor. Markhor, right? So, okay. So trophy hunt. So if we were to rephrase it as a question, research question that we're going to answer, let's do that. Let's say trophy hunting of markhor is to study the impact of trophy hunting of markhor in one place in Pakistan. Okay, let's say in Pakistan for now. Maybe there's different areas. So that can be a research question that we're going to answer. So that is good for this one, because what we want to do is now to answer that question, we have to break it up, right? So what are the different components that go into answering this question? Some of it has already come up in the chat actually with what even Helena was saying, where does the money go? Where does all of that come in? So let's put that in the chat. If you want to break this up, tease it apart. What are the different components that go into asking this question? Am I clear? You know what I mean? Like, what does it mean when we say to study the impact of trophy hunting of markhor in Pakistan? So to study that, maybe we want to know, and this is only from the social sciences. We're not looking at the ecology. So ecology, for example, if you're looking at, we look at the population. Is the population increasing? Is the population decreasing of markhor since trophy hunting happened? Before trophy hunting, there are different variables. So similarly with trophy hunting and the social sciences, what are the dimensions that we might want to go into to answering this question? So to study the impact of trophy hunting, and think that can be deductive because there can be many different components. So also we can talk about how this can be deductive or inductive in the chat. So if you want to put that in. Sal, is it clear? Do we want to break it down more?
Yes, I have typed it in the chat box. I've written to study the impact of trophy hunting of markhor in some province of Pakistan. You can put whatever province.
Yeah, put a province, whichever one you. Maybe Ghulam and someone can help. Ghulam can help us with the name of a province. So what do you think would be important? What do you think would be neat? Like, okay, so to break it down, firstly, like impact. Okay, so this on the local community, right? So what do we want to look at? Maybe we want to look at income, which is an obvious one. Maybe we want to also look at support for conservation, right? So what does support mean? We can look at attitudes, we can look at perception, we can even look at behavior. Has hunting of other animals increased? Has hunting of other animals decreased? Or has and so many interesting points actually came up because they're saying now they want to ensure also the markhor because they're seeing it as more valuable than the snow leopard. So also look at does trophy hunting increase value of only just that species? Does it increase value of everything else? Because this is a broad question, So these are different dimensions that can go into answering this question.
Gulam says we need to design before and after questions.
Mm-hmm.
Iftikhar says to analyze the impact of trophy hunting on economy and livelihood of local communities would be better
Yeah,
because it's more specific. And
exactly. Great.
Gulam suggests that we can put Baltistan as a province.
Yeah, yeah,
The other elements that go into studying, the response variable is attitudes.
yeah,
That Choki says it could be attitudes. Daniel says
yeah,
also look at wildlife value orientation.
yeah. Yeah, great, fantastic. So these are really important points. So it would probably take some time, like to sit down and break it down. But the more detail you have in this, the better, right? So it's a whole range of things because, like we're saying, so when you start with this, you realize, okay, maybe it's too broad, right? But then supposing we were doing a more inductive base where you go out there and you don't have a theory and you're trying to figure it out and you're just looking at what are the impacts. So in this sense, you kind of go ask people and you keep it really broad because we're not very sure what it impacts on. It could be income, it could be attitudes, it could be perception. So you kind of go out there and you ask people, how has trophy hunting benefited you? Like, how has trophy hunting impacted your life? Right? So then they might give you questions like, oh, it's made my income really good. Maybe it's changed my value for conservation or something like that. Right? So you keep the questions broad and you keep it open ended and see what kind of comes in. But for a more deductive approach, you can have factors that are very strong already. So, and you go and ask questions related to that. So you might be like, okay, income is going to be increased, which means, okay, attitudes are going to improve, which means perceptions, it means behavior is also going to change. So then you have questions related to that, like what was the income with, increased income with trophy hunting? How has that improved? Things like that, right? The other thing that I want to say is communities are not homogeneous. So not probably everybody is involved in trophy hunting in this village or across villages. There might be some people who are more involved, some people who are less involved. So even getting those variances and dimensions in will be important in the research question. So if you're looking at studying the impact, so then you want to say, is the impact uniform across society, or do certain people benefit more than other people, right? So these come up to when we are breaking down the main research question into smaller into smaller parts for us to actually understand what are the different components that go into making this question. And the more detail we go into in that, the better our research is going to be and the better our study is going to be. And this can come either from our own intuition or from being in the landscape, but also from literature. By looking at other studies that have looked at this, by looking at other landscapes that have looked at similar things or looked at conservation interventions, by understanding these frameworks, by understanding these factors. Another useful thing would also be looking at frameworks that can help answer these because they might have covered different dimensions of this. Like off the top of my head, for example, when we're looking at management of resources, community-based management, Ostram's framework of socio-ecological systems goes into great detail of looking at these different factors. So sometimes it's just easy to look at a framework and be like, does it cover all this? Does it check all this? And it's also easier to defend sometimes. So that's one way of breaking down the research question, by really, teasing it apart, looking at the different components of what does it mean by impact, who is the local community, what are the different components of the local community, these impacts, whether it's advantages or disadvantages, do they travel across? And Helena also brought up the important point of power dynamics. Does it trickle down to the local community, or is does this stay on top, or is a lot of the benefits only reaped by officials? Does it actually come down? So these components are important to tease apart when we have a research question.
Ranjini,
Yeah.
Helena also has another interesting comment. She
Huh?
says a good research question could be, for example, to see actual data on the flow of funds or benefits for trophy hunting events.
Yeah.
But also with snow leopards, we are talking about wildlife, whereas with endangered black rhino case or
Mm-hmm.
canned hunting of lions in Africa, these are not animals in the wild. This seems very different.
I mean, it depends, no? Because in Africa also they're talking about, but a lot of the issues were similar, and they were talking about managed reserves, which again brings us back to the question of wild, and how that's again a spectrum. So I'd say it depends, but that's also interesting to dwell more into. Would you like to say more about that, Helena?
I might just add really quickly that,
Mm-hmm.
things like ecotourism seem to be something that could benefit people locally. For example, people going to see animals or to go maybe climb mountains in Nepal, where they might be staying with locals and get guest houses or the tea houses along the way, and the money
Mm-hmm.
goes directly to them. But someone spending $350,000 for trophy hunting, they're not going to be staying with the locals. Probably they're going to be, staying, somewhere very expensive that is less seen directly by the local people.
Yeah, that's so that would be a hypothesis, right? So that is actually driven by, so what Helena just mentioned is for trophy hunting, these are the flow of money, which would go into answering her previous question. So that's one way of breaking it down. So then to answer that, you'd have to actually, so the hypothesis is that a lot of when it comes to, so then, okay, let me take a step back. So she's drawn a comparison between trophy hunting and ecotourism. And her hypothesis is that with ecotourism, more of the money goes to local communities, whereas with trophy hunting, most of the money goes out of the communities. And that's comparative case study. It's very testable, and you can actually follow it through, and it's focused and it's answerable. So then in this landscape, you basically pick. Okay, we'll come to that. We'll come to the study design part of it. But yeah, so again, that's a question because you're going to be looking at between trophy hunting and what benefits local communities better, trophy hunting or ecotourism in a certain landscape. So that again is a research question that one can answer, and then breaking it down into these different components and trying to identify what needs to be answered. So Isal, how much time do we have?
It's 2:25 now, so we have about
Okay,
a little over
yeah.
an hour.
Okay. Then I'm gonna wrap up because we'll go to the breakout session, which I think is the more fun part. Yeah. So then, what is an aim? So the aim is a larger question in some sense. The aim of the study is no. The aim can be like to study the impact of trophy hunting in local communities. The objective is all the little things that we were talking about. The different components that go into answering this question, and each aim has to be completely focused. So all the things that we were talking about, the research question kind of applies to the aim. And the objectives are what we're talking about when you're talking about breaking down a research question, right? So if you are looking at, say, let's take Helena's question, where you're looking at comparing the impacts of trophy hunting and ecotourism in a local community, what do we want to find out, right? So the objectives then would be say income. What is the income that a community gets, the local community gets from trophy hunting? What is the income that the local community gets from ecotourism? Who benefits from this? So as you break it down, it answers a lot of these questions. Maybe we want to say, okay, how do values change compared to trophy hunting versus ecotourism? Then you have to break down what impacts mean. Impacts in the income, impacts in the values, it can be behavior, and each of your objectives go into answering your aim, right? So the aim is the larger picture. The objectives are the little puzzle pieces that you're going to fit in. And again, this determines like whether it's inductive or deductive, it changes slightly, right? So I just want to, I think now, I hope that's clear. If there's any questions like regarding research question, please type it in. But for the breakout sessions, and I think it's already kind of started with the trophy hunting, is what we're going to do is we're going to divide you guys same into breakout groups, and we'll have like one person monitoring each of it so that it can be easy for the summary. And each research group can come up with a question that is based on trophy hunting. It can be based on the reading that we sent. And a lot of the reading was more Africa focused, but it's similar to snow leopard landscapes as well. But it also doesn't have to be on the reading, because I think many of you are probably familiar with with trophy hunting in snow leopard landscapes, or there are opinions on it. So maybe think of a research question that's around trophy hunting. And the elements of a research question is that it's non-biased, it's focused, it's answerable, it's relevant. Then you break down the research question into the different components of it, identify whether you want to have it as deductive or inductive, and finally identify the aims and the objectives of the research question. So then we can come back and we can discuss this in the session, and then maybe we can maybe people can comment also on other people and say if it's okay or not, and we can just discuss it. Is that okay? Yeah, any questions, comments, anything?
Shanja, I'm not able to see the breakout option. Can you see it?
Okay. For me, I'm not even, okay, I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen. No, I can't see it.
Yeah, usually it shows.
Yeah, try the 3 dots and click on the dots.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll manually assign participants to me.
So you guys can pick, because of course it's so broad, pick like everything, like the state, the study site, the question. So in your research group, you kind of you can pick those aspects of it.
Just to comment, Ranjini, when we're waiting for the research group, can I say something about what you guys were talking about? Just a thought that came to mind. I was just thinking, I mean, I don't know if this is true, but I hypothesized that actually ecotourism could have the same pitfalls as trophy hunting, because a lot of investment comes from outside into those areas, and it can, as trophy hunting, it depends how it's managed, who's involved, and how it's planned, can actually be a very not stay in the community and go out of the community itself, or only certain people in the community benefit and the rest of the community may not benefit. So because there's so much money as well involved in ecotourism as in trophy hunting, and I think that's when things get delicate or difficult, there's so much money, so that might lead to more chances of corruption if there's not good regulatory system in place or other management in place. So, I mean, I don't know if this is always true. It depends on case specific, location, area and stuff, but I think it's an interesting situation. I wouldn't necessarily think ecotourism is maybe a better solution at all times. I think we should be very careful the way we pitch that as a solution.
Thanks, Justine. I think so one of the reasons that we picked trophy hunting specifically is to also illustrate the point that our values and where we come from also drives our hypothesis, and it drives it drives a lot of these questions, right? And trophy hunting is something that's so controversial. There's also a lot of moral and ethical things behind it. It can also drive the way we think about these questions. So that's one of the reasons we also picked it. So thanks so much, Justine, for bringing up these other aspects, because sometimes we just might want to say ecotourism is the better option because it feels more palatable. So, a lot of our hypotheses might be driven by that as well. It's possible, which is also fine, I think, because I think it's just important that we recognize that our stances of what we are and where we come from also can influence the questions we ask, but hopefully the study design and everything, and we're going to have to be comfortable with the results that come out of it, right? So yeah, so that's, but yeah, Justine, that's also a very important point. So if we were to ask these questions, and these hypotheses can drive a lot of these, and breaking down can hopefully help us answer this and what we're going to be finding. But yeah, Sal, are the breakout groups done?
Yes, it's done.
Okay.
So let me just assign one person to facilitate. So in breakout room 1, can Choki lead? As in, you just have to make sure that everyone speaks and gets a fair chance to discuss. In breakout room 2, maybe Gulam could be the leader. Breakout room 3, perhaps Mohammed. And breakout room 4, Nilofer. So yeah, I'll start the breakout room. How much time do we have?
Excuse me, Saroni, may I say something?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I might not be the right person to be to coordinate the group 4, because I just joined the session a few minutes ago, so I might mislead the group. So I was just sharing.
Sorry for me as well, because there is lots of distraction. I couldn't get your points whole because our internet was very poor. This is Ghulam.
Okay.
Yeah, because the internet was coming and going, so I was not fully concentrated what you were saying.
No problem, no problem.
So please,
in the first group,
another group, yeah. Another member.
Okay, no problem. So in the first group, can Adnan lead? And the second one, maybe Iftikhar? I hope that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. That would be great. I was just thinking maybe to just share this issue with you and say that it would be better to pass the coordination to another person who's been present during the last 30 minutes or more. That's it.
Sure. Okay, so we are opening the room now. How much time do we have? 10 minutes?
Yeah, 10 minutes. And what we're going to be looking at, oh, it's already 2:30. Okay, now.
Yeah.
Okay, so what we're going to be looking at very quickly is, again, like looking at the research question, breaking it down, and, whether it's inductive, deductive, and focusing on these different aspects of what we had said with the research question, right? Is it focused? Is it, is it relevant? Is it answerable? And finally, like looking at identifying the aims and objectives of the question. Yes, perfect. Aliana, great. Thanks so much. That's great. Okay, awesome. So we can have the breakout groups and then meet again at 2:46. Thank you.
Okay.
5
yeah,
seconds.
so the another thing. Okay. Are we in the main room?
Yes, Iftikhar, you are. Yeah.
Yes. Hi. Sorry, yes, the time ran
The
out.
main room.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh my God, we have just discussed 2 points, and it went.
Oh, it's so abrupt.
We didn't notice the time. We are very sorry.
Sorry, that's okay. We'll actually have another breakout room. So what we'll do now is we'll just wait till everyone comes back in, or almost everyone's back in. So what we can do is we'll just go through methodology and study design now, and then all of you guys go back to the same breakout groups. And then for the question that you've identified, oh, maybe we should, okay, very quickly, how many breakout groups were there, Saloni? 4, right? Yeah, so very quickly, maybe you guys can share your questions that you guys discussed either in the chat or out aloud. The first group.
I think that was Choki.
Hello. Yeah. Actually, Adnan was supposed to be the leader, but because he was new to the session, so I'm just going to announce our question. We were a bit short of time, so we just continue on exploring the question that has been already discussed in the chat. So a very general question, but what are the trophy hunting impacts in, let's say, for example, a certain area in Pakistan?
Okay.
Yeah, and then we actually discuss about it. Should I say the other parts? For example, what we are going to assess.
I think that we can do after we come back. So when we go into the methods and methodology, we'll do that in the closing session. I thought it'd be interesting to just look at the questions because that will determine our study designs. I just want to quickly look at the questions we've come up with. Okay, so Alyan, so thanks.
Great, what are the impacts?
Yeah, what are the impacts on the local community? Okay, thank you. So again, we have impacts of trophy hunting on community perspectives towards wildlife conservation. Great. Thank you. That's focused and specific. Thanks. Anyone? What about group 3? Or
no, so group 2 is Iftikhar, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. So our question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Our question was to analyze the impact of trophy hunting of markhor on economy and livelihood of local communities in Pakistan.
Okay. Fantastic. Thanks. And group 4? Are we done? No.
Group 4 is Aliana.
Okay, Aliana.
They've said impacts of trophy hunting on community perspectives towards wildlife conservation.
Okay.
And group 3, I don't remember who was the leader.
Yes,
was it?
Jen, yes. We'd like you to share. I think Jen asked, no?
Okay.
Can she share?
Yeah. Mohammed, would you like to?
Hello.
Yes.
Are you listening?
Yes.
Yes.
Basically, the question arises that is trophy hunting have effect on the genetically affect the species overall?
Okay. Thanks, Mohammed. So that's an important question. However, I think that's more ecological, right? Because what we need to answer that would be looking at the ecological aspects of it. Is there something, maybe we can think of something that's more related to the social aspects, like, a local community or, power dynamics, or is there some way we can change that question to maybe the social impacts?
Yes. In Pakistan, in the area of Punjab or I have interacted with a local community where trophy hunting is going on. So the overall impact of the community, the overall impact of the trophy hunting on a community is good. So my question is, through research we have to find out whether it is based on whether in Pakistan we have lack of research on these topics, whether the money that we get from the trophy hunting, whether it is fully given to the community or not. This is my question. That community is fully whether the community is fully beneficial from the money that they get from the trophy hunting or not.
Okay. Great, thanks, Mohammed. So maybe with that question, we can look at the distribution of economic benefits, right, to the local community. How is it distributed?